Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive deep with me today?
Always ready to dive deep.
We're really going there today, tackling a tough topic, but an important one, the Armenian Genocide.
Definitely a heavy one, but crucial to understand.
Right, and we're lucky to have some great material to work with. We're going to be digging into excerpts from A Brief History of the Armenian Genocide by Sarah Cohan. It's from a 2005 issue of Social Education, that publication for social studies teachers.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
So we're going to get into the nitty-gritty, go beyond the surface-level stuff. And you know how sometimes you read a quote that just stops you in your tracks?
Oh, tell me about it.
This one's from Henry Morgenthau. He was the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during that time. He said, "I am confident that the whole history of the human race contains no such horrible episode as this. The great massacres and persecutions of the past seem almost insignificant when compared with the sufferings of the Armenian race in 1915.
Wow.
I know, right? It really hits you with the sheer weight of what happened.
Absolutely. It's a lot to process.
It really is. So before we get into all of that, let's take a step back. For those who might not know, who are the Armenians?
Well, the Armenians, they have this incredibly rich and ancient history. Their story goes back centuries, even before the first century. They have their own unique language, a vibrant culture, and a history that played out over a much larger area than just the Armenia we see on maps today. One really interesting thing about them, they were one of the very first societies to fully embrace Christianity.
Really?
Yeah, we're talking way back in 301 CE.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's amazing, right? And it wasn't just a religion for them. It became a core part of who they were, a defining characteristic in a region where other religions were dominant.
The 301 CE, that's a powerful legacy.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about the depth of what was lost. And it wasn't always smooth sailing for them, was it? Their history must play a role in the events that led up to the genocide.
You're absolutely right. Modern history has been anything but peaceful for the Armenian people. They had a brief period of independence after World War I, but then got absorbed into the Soviet Union. Finally, they gained their independence again in 1991. It's a testament to their resilience, but also highlights the geopolitical pressures that have shaped their fate for centuries.
Pressures that are key to understanding what happened. It's kind of like they were caught in this web of conflicting interests, trying to navigate their own identity while facing pressure from all sides. So how did it escalate? How did all of that tension explode into something as horrific as genocide?
Well, by the late 1800s, things were coming to a head. The Ottoman Empire was already in decline and facing pressure from within. Armenians were increasingly advocating for their rights, for basic protections. Imagine living somewhere for centuries, but always being treated like a second-class citizen, denied basic freedoms, constantly living in fear. It's understandable why they demanded change.
Absolutely, demands for basic human rights. And this is where it gets frustrating. You'd think international treaties would be a source of hope, right? Offering some sort of protection. But in this case, it really backfired, didn't it?
It did.
Cohen talks about this, a Treaty of Berlin in 1878. It was supposed to help the Armenians, but it actually left them more vulnerable. What went wrong?
It's a perfect example of how international politics can be. So often, it's more about power than people. The treaty, on paper, was supposed to protect Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire.
Sounds good, right?
Right. Sounds like a step in the right direction.
But, and here's the thing, instead of giving that responsibility to outside forces that might actually enforce those protections, the treaty made the Ottoman Sultan responsible for their safety.
Wait, seriously, they were left at the mercy of the very power structure that was oppressing them in the first place. Exactly. And it gets worse. This concession was made to appease other European powers, like Russia, who were more concerned with, their own interests in the region. The Armenians, they became pawns in this bigger game. The Sultan felt threatened by the Armenians' calls for reform. And with this international support, or lack thereof, he unleashed this wave of violence, the Hamidian massacres from 1894 to 1896.
This is where it gets truly horrific. And it wasn't just some isolated incident. This was mass violence on a huge scale. And what's even more disturbing, it wasn't kept secret. Cohen points out that major newspapers, even here in the U.S., were reporting on it as it happened.
I know, it's chilling.
Imagine reading about these atrocities in the New York Times, witnessing these early warnings of genocide in real time.
It's a horrifying thought. The world was watching this tragedy unfold, but it seemed powerless to stop it. These Hamidian massacres, they were a brutal foreshadowing of what was to come. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians were slaughtered. Estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000. It's difficult to even comprehend.
It's heartbreaking, and honestly, it really makes you question how far we've really come as a global community when it comes to preventing these kinds of atrocities. It's a chilling thought, the world watching and yet so much of the time unable or unwilling to act. And it only gets darker from here, but Cohen does mention this brief period, a glimmer of hope, with the rise of the Young Turks in 1908. Who were they? What kind of hope did they represent for the Armenians?
The Young Turks, they were a fascinating bunch, kind of a mixed bag when you really get into it. They were a group of reformers within the Ottoman Empire, like progressive-minded Turks, who were fed up with the Sultan's rule, the corruption, the stagnation. They wanted to see a modernized Ottoman state, one that was inclusive, where everyone, regardless of their ethnicity or religion, had equal rights.
That sounds promising, a step towards a more just and equitable society.
It did seem that way, at least initially, and you can imagine, for the Armenians who had endured so much oppression, it must have felt like a breath of fresh air, a chance for a brighter future.
I can only imagine. But this is a story about genocide, so we know that hope wouldn't last.
Tragically, you're right. While they did overthrow the Sultan, and even implemented some reforms early on, this more extreme nationalist faction within the Young Turks gained power. Their ideology was basically Turkey for the Turks, a dangerous and exclusionary ideology that viewed the Armenians with suspicion and hostility.
So the very idea of a diverse and inclusive state, it got twisted into yet another form of oppression.
It's a classic example of how quickly things can change, how good intentions can be corrupted. And this corruption led to the Adana massacre in 1909, a targeted attack on Armenians that resulted in tens of thousands of deaths. It shattered any remaining hope for peaceful coexistence.
It's a tragedy, that shattered hope. It's just unimaginable. And all of this is happening as the world is on the brink of World War I. Never a good time to be a vulnerable population caught in the middle of global conflict.
Exactly. In World War I, it acted as this catalyst, intensifying everything. The Ottoman Empire, already weakened, joined the war on the side of Germany, and as the war dragged on, they suffered these devastating losses against Russia, their old enemy. And guess who they blamed for these military setbacks?
The Armenians. It's a pattern we see throughout history, isn't it? When those in power feel threatened, when their authority is challenged, they often look for a scapegoat.
It's a tale as old as time, and it's a scary reminder of how easily fear and resentment can be manipulated, how easily people can be turned against their neighbors. In the case of the Armenians, it set the stage for something truly horrific.
And that brings us to 1915, the year the systematic extermination of the Armenians began. How did it happen? How did the Ottoman government carry out this horrific plan?
By the spring of 1915, the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, they decided to eliminate the Armenian population. They were the ruling party in the Ottoman Empire, so they had the power, the infrastructure to carry out their plans. And they used the chaos of the war, the escalating nationalist sentiment, to mask their true intentions.
So this wasn't just random violence. This was planned, organized, systematic.
Precisely. They were methodical about it. It started by targeting Armenian intellectuals, community leaders, anyone with influence. The idea was to silence those voices, to make it easier to control the population.
Silence the leaders, break their spirit, and then move in for the kill. It's a horrifying tactic that's been used again and again throughout history.
And it's tragically effective. Once they'd eliminated the leadership, they moved on to mass deportations. Families ripped from their homes, forced to march hundreds of miles to the Syrian desert. These weren't relocations, these were death marches. Many died along the way, starvation, disease, exposure.
The images that Cohen describes are just heart-wrenching rivers filled with bodies, disease spreading like wildfire, families torn apart. She mentions a photograph taken in 1919 of an Armenian refugee woman clinging to her son. It's a powerful image that speaks volumes about the suffering they endured.
It's a reminder of the human cost of hatred and intolerance. And remember, this wasn't just about physical extermination, it was about cultural erasure. Churches and schools were destroyed, their language, traditions, all targeted. The goal was to wipe the slate clean.
To erase any trace of them. By 1923, when the genocide had run its course, how many Armenians had been murdered?
It's difficult to get an exact number, but even the most conservative estimates put the death toll at 1.5 million. It's a staggering number, an almost unimaginable loss of life.
1.5 million souls. And we talked about this earlier, but it's important to remember, the world wasn't completely unaware of what was happening. Newspapers, like the New York Times, reported on the massacres. So why wasn't more done to stop it?
That's a question that continues to haunt us. Part of it was the fog of war. The world's attention was consumed by this global conflict. But there was also a deliberate effort, a propaganda campaign by the Ottoman government to downplay what was happening. And tragically, for a long time, it worked.
And the aftermath. Was there any justice? Was there any accountability for what happened?
There were trials, but many of those responsible escaped punishment. And adding insult to injury, the Turkish government, which succeeded the Ottoman Empire, has consistently denied the genocide. They claim the numbers were exaggerated, that it wasn't a planned extermination, a denial that sadly continues to this day.
It's difficult to even fathom denying something so horrific, so well documented.
It's a testament to the power of denial, the ways in which nations, like individuals, often choose to bury uncomfortable truths rather than confront them. But as we've seen time and time again, the truth has a way of resurfacing.
And that's why it's so important to keep these stories alive, to honor the memories of those lost by making sure what happened is never forgotten. We have a responsibility to learn from these dark chapters of history so that we can hopefully prevent them from happening again.
I couldn't agree more. We can't allow these atrocities to be swept under the rug of history. We have to remember, and we have to remain vigilant.
Well said. A huge thank you for joining us today and for sharing your expertise on this difficult but incredibly important topic. And to all of you listening, thank you for diving deep with us. We hope this conversation has given you a better understanding of the Armenian Genocide and its lasting impact. Remember, knowledge is power, and the more we know about the past, the better equipped we are to create a more just and compassionate future.